Okay, we're going to try this for the 7th time. I'm getting a little bit perturbed at technology at the moment, but that's what happens. So, great job so far. We have many students that are in the A and B range at this point in the ball game, and the ones that are a little bit lower, most of you all are trying to get the grades up. Just remember to ask questions if there's any concerns, technology issues, go on a vacation or anything like that. Get with me early on. It's always better to get with me early on. Most times we can develop a plan so that you get things in on time and don't miss points on that. So make sure and do that. This video here is for Chapter 8. You'll have a reading, you'll have a PowerPoint that we'll watch hopefully while you're watching this video. Discussion board that's not on Chapter 8. It's a little off topic. And the quiz for Chapter 8. You'll also need to look for at least 6 pins to add to your DI collection on communication disorders chapter. And the DI lesson plan is also due on Sunday. And make sure you utilize the templates that are there. It will make it much easier because you do not have to do the whole lesson plan. Look for the highlighted items and choose one of the templates. So go on your PowerPoint. The first slide should be Chapter 8 homework. So look at that. That'll get you started for this week. The next slide has a YouTube video. So if you will, go ahead and pause me and go ahead and look at that YouTube video and then come back. Okay. Hopefully you enjoyed watching the video on communication. I think it will help you get started into this chapter. The review, there are about 3 items that I just kept in there. These are typical reviews that I'll ask the class to look over, and we'll have some discussion. Thought I'd leave them in there for your benefit. Then I've left, there's some Chapter 8 questions that a lot of times have given difficulties, so I've given you the page numbers to look at those so you can look at them before the quiz. Then let's get started into the book's PowerPoint. Objectives. Identify and provide examples of 4 major functions of communication. You'll describe the characteristics of each of the following communication disorders. There's speech and sound disorders, fluency disorders, voice disorders, and language disorders. You'll be able to explain why the number of children with speech and language impairments is much higher than the number of children who receive services under the speech or language impairment category. You'll also be able to describe and identify causes of primary types of speech and language impairments, list the major components of a comprehensive evaluation used to detect the presence and/or extent of the communication disorder, along with identifying the basic goals, common elements of effective interventions for speech sound errors and language disorders. And lastly, you'll be able to explain how speech and language pathologist's role changes as a function of the setting in which a child with communication disorders is served. Let's look at the definition. Most of you had speech in high school, and so went over a lot of what communication definition is the interactive exchange of information, ideas, feelings, needs, and desires. It involves a message, a sender who expresses the message, and a receiver who responds to the message. The functions of communication include narrating, explaining and informing, requesting, and expressing as parts of that definition. Language is a formalized code that a group of people use to communicate with one another. It has 5 dimensions of language. You will want to know each and one of these really well, especially the ones in red. Phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, and pragmatics. Also want to mention that dialects are the learned patterns of speech and language appropriate to families and communities. The next slide, language includes not only sounds but also letters and elements of sign language. I'd like for you to look at page 258 to make sure you have a good understanding of what language includes. I imagine it'll include some things that maybe you weren't thinking about. The definitions of some of the items of speech is the oral production of language. Speech sounds are the product of 4 related processes. It's respiration, which is breathing that provides power. You have phonation, which is production of sound by muscle contraction. And then you also have resonation, which is sound quality shaped as it passes through the throat, mouth, and sometimes nasal cavities. And also, importantly, the articulation, formation of recognizable speech sounds. Then I have another slide in here that I'd like for you to look at 260 and 261. How do definitions of speech and language impairments relate to one another and to typical language development? Those 2 pages will help you get that question down before the quiz. Typical speech and language development. Most children follow a predictable sequence in the acquisition of speech and language skills. Children between the ages of 11 and 36 months of age are exposed to a tremendous amount of spoken language. Children who are learning to talk practice their new skill relentlessly. And I think those that are parents or those that have been around kids of this age group can be quite knowledgeable on how relentless they can be. The next one, bridging the 30 million word gap, is a reference to the vast difference in the number of words that some children from poverty background hear by age 4 compared to with experiences of more affluent children. And this can also be identified in those children that don't have many siblings, or those that don't have very many playmates around their neighborhood, or maybe aren't in daycare that gives them a lot of time that they can talk to others of their same age. Then we have 2 communication disorders defined. We have the ASHA definition and the IDEA definition. ASHA says an impairment in the ability to receive, send, process, and comprehend concepts of verbal, nonverbal, and graphic symbol systems, whereas IDEA definition says a communication disorder such as stuttering, impaired articulation, a language impairment, or a voice impairment that adversely affects the child's educational performance. Remember that term at the bottom. I've asked you to remember that quite a few times. It must adversely affect the child's educational performance. Another item I'd like to put in here is, when does a communication difference become a communication disorder? And this is a very easy statement here. When a communication difference involves the extent of impact on one's life, it becomes a communication disorder. Now let's look at speech impairment. Speech is impaired when it deviates so from the speech of other people that it either calls attention to itself, and or interferes with communication, and or provokes stress in the speaker or listener. There are 3 types of speech impairments. They are articulation disorder, which is errors in the production of sounds. There is fluency disorders, which are difficulties with the flow or rhythm of speech. And then there is voice disorders, which are problems with the quality or use of one's voice. Language disorders. Language disorder is impaired comprehension and or use of spoken, written, and or other symbol systems. Language disorder may involve any of the combination of those above terms: the phonology, morphology, and syntax, which is a form of language; the content of language, which is semantics; and or the function of language, which is the pragmatics, or any combination thereof. Language disorders may involve receptive or expressive disorders also. You'll want to know what those terms are. Characteristics of speech sound errors. There's distortions, substitutions, omissions. There's also additions. There's articulation disorders, which is when a child is not able to produce a given sound physically because that sound is not in their repertoire. There's also phonological disorders, which is when a child has the ability to produce a given sound and does so correctly in some instances, but not in others, or maybe in some environments they do and some they don't. Characteristics of a fluency disorder is an interruption in the flow of speaking characterized by atypical rate, rhythm, and repetition in sounds, syllables, words, and phrases. Stuttering and cluttering are some examples given in the book. Voice disorders is a phonation disorder, causes the voice to sound breathy, hoarse, husky, or strained. Now mine is sounding a little hoarse and strained because this is like the 6th time I've tried this video, so I'm hoping this one goes. Also, resonance disorders results in hypernasality and hyponasality. You'll want to make sure you know the difference between those two also for the upcoming quiz. Positive reinforcement and confidence building are some of the typical effective treatment for fluency disorders. Kids know they have problems with speaking or with hearing, how to pronounce them, their articulation, all of that. And they don't need to hear negativity. They need to be positive reinforcement along with that. And page 267 and 68 talks about that. Characteristics of language disorders. They involve problems in one or more of the 5 dimensions that we've discussed earlier. Language delay implies a child is slow to develop linguistic skills but acquires them in a typical sequence. So they acquire them in a typical sequence, but they're just slower, so there's a language delay. Whereas language disorders suggest a disruption in the usual rate and or sequence in which the specific language skills emerge. So there is a difference in how they are learned. Another item I want you to look at are what types of communication disorders they are. And so like statements like the dogs run home and that foop is dude. What do they signal? So look at page 276 to look at a little bit more information there. The prevalence in 2012-2013 school there are about 1,356,000 students, children ages 6 to 21, that receive special education in the special education and related services under IDEA category of speech and language. It is the second largest disability category under IDEA. Approximately 2/3 of school-age children served are boys. And 50% of children who receive special ed services because of a primary disability also have communication disorders. And this is why there's that discrepancy in the amount served under speech and language category. 50% are served in another area, and then as a related services, they're receiving speech and language services. The percentage of children with speech and language disorder decreases significantly from the earlier to the later grades. Here are a couple slides on speech impairment causes. Cleft palate. I was actually served under speech most of my young life until about middle school. I was born with a cleft lip and cleft palate. So I had speech services for articulation and sound. So I had to learn my S's and T's. I had absence of teeth at times too, so they worked with that. But by middle school, I basically had, when I was in that clinical setting with them, I had all the knowledge and skills to produce a good sound. So that's why I was dismissed in middle school, because I knew it in that setting. It was just up to me to make sure that I continue to do it in my social settings. Paralysis of speech muscles, craniofacial abnormalities, enlarged adenoids, TBI, and dysarthria are some of the causes listed there. Also, developmental intellectual disabilities, autism, child abuse, neglect, hearing loss, structural abnormalities of the speech mechanism, and also aphasia, genetics, and environmental influences can affect that also. What are the major components of a comprehensive evaluation to detect presence and extent of communication disorder? By the end of the next few slides, you should know that. There's identification and assessment. There's a screening and teacher observation, which is typically done in that pre-K, first grade section, second grade at the very latest. The components are case history, physical examination, articulation, hearing, phonological awareness and processing, vocabulary and overall language development, assessment of language function, language samples, and observations in natural settings. There's more than one observation. Assessment of children who are culturally diverse. You'll need to assess language proficiency in both the first and second languages when determining a culturally and linguistically different child's communication competence. I know we had this in a linguistic way. We had a student that came to us from one of the southern states and had a very distinct dialect or way of speaking that was not really your typical speech and language. So you have to watch both of those. Do not diagnose with a speech language disorder if problems are observed only in English and not in their first language or dialect. Include assessment of basic interpersonal communication skills and cognitive academic language proficiency. And assessment for the purpose of identifying children with disabilities are required by IDEA to be conducted in the child's native language. So you have to make sure and look at that when you have some that are culturally diverse. Educational approaches, you have articulation and phonological errors, which is discrimination in production activities. Fluency disorders, they'll use behavioral principles and self-monitoring. Voice disorders, they'll have medical examinations and or direct vocal rehabilitation. And language disorders, vocabulary building, naturalistic interventions. And then they also might use augmentative and alternative communication they use a diverse set of strategies and methods, and those also are the different educational approaches. I do want to go into a little bit more the augmentative and alternative communication, ACC. It refers to a diverse set of strategies and methods to assist individuals who cannot meet their communication needs through speech or writing. An ACC entails 3 aided or unaided components. It'll have a representational symbol set or vocabulary, a means for selecting the symbols, and a means for transmitting the symbols. Symbol sets and symbol systems for ACC. They'll be selecting the symbols and transmitting. So I'd look at that in the book to have a better idea of those type of devices. The next slide, you should be able to answer after you get done with this chapter, so go back to it. Placement options. In 2011-2012, 87% of children with speech or language impairments were served in the general classroom. So typically those students are not being served in a self-contained resource setting. At that point, 6% are in resource rooms and only 4% in separate classrooms. Some examples of service delivery models. This is where you need to understand the different ways that the SLPs may come into your classroom or items. So look at this section of the book and really get an idea of what monitoring is, pull out, collaborative consultation, classroom or curriculum-based, separate classroom, community-based, and combination. There are also many school districts that are starting to not diagnose as a special education need some of the speech and language components until later on, because they're finding out that if they can use a collaborative consultation type method where they go in early and maybe have some small groups and teach the teachers how to help with some of these students that are just maybe delayed, then they won't be putting as many into special education. Because in the past, there were an awful lot of students that after a year or two were dismissed early on, and that's because they were just a little bit delayed in their processes. So that's some of the things that some schools are doing. The next slide talks about the different qualifications. I do want you to look at these 4. I've checked the links, so go ahead and click the links and look at them and to see what these are, what a team would have to go through to state that a child is a student that needs special education in these 4 areas. There's speech fluency, speech voice, language impairment, and sound system disorder. So anyway, that concludes this one. Next week we'll be looking at physical disabilities and ADHD in Chapter 11. So we'll go from there. We'll talk to you later. You all have a great week.